A forbidden love story. There are moments that change lives forever, moments so unexpected that they leave everyone questioning everything they thought they knew. On a warm Saturday morning in Atlanta, Georgia, friends and family gathered inside one of the city's most respected churches to celebrate what many believed was the perfect love story. The choir stood ready to sing. At the altar stood Moses Carter, a successful businessman admired for his generosity and quiet determination. Across from him was Naomi Brooks, an accomplished attorney whose intelligence and kindness had earned her the respect of everyone who knew her. They smiled at one another with the confidence of two people who believed they had overcome every obstacle standing between them. But neither of them realized that before the minister could pronounce them husband and wife, a truth buried for more than 3 decades would come crashing into their lives and change everything they believed about love, loyalty, lies. Just as the minister prepared to begin the vows, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the church flew open with a force that echoed through the sanctuary. Every head turned at once. An elderly woman, her hands trembling and her breathing uneven, slowly walked down the center aisle with tears streaming down her face. The room fell into complete silence as she looked directly at Moses and Naomi before shouting words that no one expected to hear on what was supposed to be the happiest day of their lives. "Stop this wedding, they can never be together." Some guests stood from their seats in disbelief while others looked toward the families, hoping someone would explain what was happening. Moses stared at the woman without saying a word, while Naomi searched her mother's face and immediately noticed something she had never seen before: fear. It wasn't the fear of embarrassment or confusion. It was the fear of someone who had spent years hoping a painful secret would never come to light, only to realize that the past had finally caught up with them. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming video. The minister quietly stepped away from the altar, unsure whether to continue the ceremony or ask everyone to leave. The elderly woman wasn't angry. She looked heartbroken, as though she had carried a burden for most of her life and could no longer remain silent. Then she said something even more disturbing. "If this marriage happens today, 2 families will spend the rest of their lives regretting it." The statement left everyone searching for answers. What could possibly be so serious that it justified interrupting a wedding in front of hundreds of people? Why had no one ever mentioned this woman before? And why did both families suddenly seem desperate to keep her from speaking? Those questions would soon uncover a chain of events stretching back more than 30 years, revealing a story of forbidden love, painful sacrifice, broken promises, and a decision made in secret that continued to shape the lives of innocent people decades later. What happened next would force everyone in that church to confront a past they believed had been buried forever. Moses Carter and Naomi Brooks never expected a simple encounter to become the beginning of a love story that would test everything they believed about trust, family, and destiny. They met during a community legal outreach event in downtown Atlanta, where local business leaders partnered with volunteer attorneys to help struggling families understand their housing rights. Moses had built a reputation as a successful entrepreneur who believed success meant very little unless it was used to lift others. Naomi had earned respect as a dedicated attorney who fought tirelessly for people who couldn't afford expensive legal representation. Their first conversation lasted only a few minutes, but those few minutes turned into hours. They discovered they shared the same values, the same faith, and the same dream of building a life centered on service rather than status. Friends would later say they had never seen 2 people connect so naturally. What began as casual conversations over coffee soon became evening walks and long phone calls that stretched late into the night. Within months, it was obvious to everyone around them that this wasn't an ordinary romance. Moses had found someone who challenged him to become a better man, while Naomi found a partner who respected her ambitions instead of asking her to sacrifice them. Together, they seemed to have everything they needed to build a lasting future. As their relationship grew stronger, so did their confidence that they had found the person they wanted to spend the rest of their lives with. Moses introduced Naomi to his closest friends, who immediately welcomed her as part of the family. Naomi did the same, proudly bringing Moses to family dinners and church gatherings, convinced that the people she loved would see exactly what she saw in him. But something unexpected happened. Instead of celebrating their relationship, both families became strangely uncomfortable. Conversations ended the moment Moses and Naomi entered the room. Invitations became less frequent. Smiles were replaced with forced silence, and simple questions about wedding plans were answered with awkward changes of subject. Whenever Naomi asked her mother what was wrong, She was told that some relationships weren't meant to happen, but no explanation ever followed. Moses faced the same response from his father, who urged him to slow down and reconsider the engagement without offering a single reason. The more they searched for answers, the more determined both families became to avoid the conversation entirely. It wasn't ordinary disapproval. It felt like fear. Fear of a truth so painful that even speaking about it might destroy everything. Then, just days after announcing their engagement, Naomi returned home to find an unmarked envelope resting against her front door. There was no postage, no return address, and no indication of who had delivered it. Inside was a single sheet of paper containing just one sentence, typed in bold black letters. "Leave Moses Carter before it's too late." There was no signature, no explanation, and no clue pointing to the sender. Naomi read the message again and again, hoping she had overlooked something, but the page offered nothing more. She immediately showed it to Moses, who tried to reassure her that it was probably the work of someone jealous of their happiness. But even as he spoke, there was uncertainty in his voice. The letter wasn't threatening. It didn't demand money or make impossible accusations. Instead, it sounded like a warning from someone who believed they were trying to save her from a terrible mistake. Neither of them realized that this mysterious message was only the first piece of a much larger puzzle. Someone knew the truth about their families, someone had remained silent for decades. The question that now haunted Moses and Naomi was impossible to ignore. The mysterious letter changed everything. Until that moment, Moses Carter and Naomi Brooks had convinced themselves that their families were simply struggling to accept how quickly their relationship had progressed. But the warning felt different. It wasn't written by someone trying to end a romance out of jealousy. It was written by someone who believed Naomi was in real danger. The question was no longer whether their families disapproved of the marriage. The question was why. Rather than allowing fear to pull them apart, Moses and Naomi made a decision that would change the course of their lives. They agreed that before walking away from the people they loved, or from each other, they would uncover the truth for themselves. They promised not to accuse anyone without evidence, not to jump to conclusions, and not to let rumors destroy the future they had worked so hard to build. They believed that every secret leaves traces behind, no matter how carefully it has been hidden. What they didn't know was that someone had spent more than 30 years making sure those traces would never be found. Their search began with old family photo albums, dusty storage boxes, and forgotten documents tucked away in attics and basements. At first, everything appeared ordinary. There were childhood birthdays, graduation ceremonies, church anniversaries, and family reunions. But the deeper they looked, the stranger the story became. Entire years seemed to be missing from both families' collections. Certain photographs had clearly been removed from albums, leaving only empty spaces where pictures had once been. In one faded photograph, Moses noticed his father standing beside a young woman Naomi had never seen before. The image had been torn almost perfectly in half, leaving only part of another person's arm visible on the edge of the picture. When Naomi showed the photograph to her mother, Gloria Brooks immediately became pale, took the picture from her hands, and quietly said it had been damaged years ago, before refusing to answer another question. That reaction only strengthened their belief that someone was protecting a painful chapter of the family's history. Determined to keep searching, Moses and Naomi visited the county records office, hoping official documents would reveal what their families refused to discuss. Instead, they encountered another mystery. Several public records connected to both families had either disappeared or contained conflicting information. Birth records listed different addresses from those found in school records. Property documents referenced people whose names never appeared anywhere else. Even church membership records contained unexplained gaps during the same period over 30 years earlier. An elderly records clerk, after noticing how frustrated the couple had become, quietly told them that old files sometimes disappeared when powerful people wanted certain stories forgotten. It wasn't proof, but it was enough to convince Moses that this wasn't a misunderstanding. Someone had deliberately erased pieces of history, and they had been successful for decades. Every answer uncovered another question, and every new discovery pointed toward a secret far greater than either of them had imagined. As the investigation continued, strange incidents began happening around them. Moses noticed the same dark SUV parked outside his office several mornings in a row before it disappeared whenever he approached. Naomi returned home one evening to discover that the boxes of family documents she had carefully organized had been disturbed, although nothing valuable had been taken. The only item missing was the torn photograph they had found days earlier. Then Moses received an anonymous phone call. The voice on the other end spoke only one sentence before hanging up. Some secrets were buried to protect the people you love. Stop looking before someone gets hurt. The warning sent a chill through both of them. This was no longer about family disapproval or old misunderstandings. Someone was actively watching their every move, determined to stop them from uncovering the truth. Yet instead of walking away, Moses and Naomi became even more determined. They had already come too far to turn back now. They believed the truth would finally set their families free. They had no idea that with every step closer to the answers, they were also stepping closer to the moment of truth. What were their families hiding the morning of the wedding? Moses Carter and Naomi Brooks tried to convince themselves that the worst was finally behind them. The unanswered questions, the anonymous warning, the missing records, and the strange phone calls had cast a shadow over what should have been the happiest season of their lives, but neither of them was willing to let fear win. They believed that whatever their families were hiding, it couldn't be powerful enough to destroy the love they had built together. They prayed a night before the wedding. Friends and relatives filled the church smiling for photographs and exchanging congratulations, yet beneath the celebration was a tension that couldn't be ignored. Moses noticed his father packing alone in a side hallway, unable to sit still for more than a few moments. Naomi watched her mother wipe tears from her face before forcing another smile whenever someone approached. Neither family looked like they were attending a joyful wedding. They looked like they were waiting for something they hoped would never happen. And then, just as the minister prepared to begin the vows, the heavy church doors burst open, bringing everyone back to the moment that would change their lives forever. The elderly woman slowly walked down the center aisle, her eyes fixed on Moses and Naomi. The silence inside the sanctuary was overwhelming. Every guest watched as she stopped only a few feet from the couple before repeating the words that had already sent shockwaves through the room. "Stop this wedding. They can never be together." This time, no one tried to interrupt her. She turned toward both families and spoke with the pain of someone who had carried the same burden for decades. She explained that more than 30 years earlier, Moses's father and Naomi's mother had once been inseparable friends. What began as loyalty between friends slowly became betrayal lies. Promises were broken, trust disappeared. When tragedy struck, instead of telling the truth, the adults involved chose to hide it. They convinced themselves they were protecting their children, but with every passing year the lie only became heavier. Families were separated, memories were erased, photographs disappeared. And records were quietly altered, until an entire chapter of their lives had almost vanished. As the elderly woman continued speaking how Moses' father dated Naomi's mother for 10 years, promise her marriage, and how Naomi's mother spent her inheritance on Moses' father's investment, she was left with nothing and her family disowned her. For choose a man over the family legacy, handing over their wealth to a man who's not married to her yet. This broke Gloria Brooks the moment she stopped hearing from Moses' father. A man she dated for 10 years believed in and trusted he with his family inheritance. She was left alone to suffer after Bishop Carter relocated to another country for business deal. Stop calling Naomi's mother. Gloria Brooks waited several years waiting to hear from him, but nothing was heard about him. Not until Gloria Brooks heard he married another woman who is now Moses' mother. Moses looked toward his father, hoping he would deny everything. Instead, Bishop Carter lowered his head and remained silent. Naomi turned toward her mother, Gloria Brooks, whose tears now confirmed what words could not. The truth was finally impossible to hide. Their parents had spent more than 3 decades protecting a story they believed should never be told. The betrayal had destroyed lifelong friendships, divided 2 families, and forced innocent people to grow up believing a version of history that was never true. Moses and Naomi realized that every warning they had received, every missing photograph they had discovered, and every unanswered question they had asked pointed back to this single moment. The life they thought they understood had been carefully built on half-truths, silence, and fear. The wedding had not been interrupted because their love was wrong. It had been interrupted because the foundation beneath both families had been shaped by a lie that could no longer remain hidden. But even after the elderly woman finished speaking, one question still remained unanswered. What exactly had happened all those years ago that caused so many people to dedicate their lives to protecting the same devastating secret? Moses Carter stood frozen at the altar, unable to process everything he had just heard. The church remained silent as every eye shifted toward Bishop Carter, the man who had spent years preaching about honesty, forgiveness, and faith. Moses slowly walked away from the altar until he stood directly in front of his father. His voice was calm, but the pain behind it was impossible to hide. "Dad, tell me she's wrong." Those 5 words echoed through the sanctuary. Bishop Carter looked into his son's eyes, but for the first time in his life he couldn't find the strength to answer. The silence lasted only a few seconds, yet it felt like a lifetime. Finally, he lowered his head and whispered, "She isn't lying." A wave of emotion swept across the room. Naomi reached for Moses's hand, but even she didn't know what to say. The truth they had spent weeks searching for was finally within reach, and it was far more painful than either of them had imagined. Taking a deep breath, Bishop Carter stepped forward and admitted that more than 30 years earlier, fear had led both families to make a decision they believed would protect everyone they loved. A tragic misunderstanding had torn apart lifelong friendships, and instead of facing the consequences with honesty, they chose silence. They buried documents, destroyed photographs, and agreed never to speak about that chapter of their lives again. As the years passed, the lie became easier to maintain than the truth. New generations were raised without knowing what had really happened, while those who carried the secret convinced themselves they were preserving peace. But every birthday, every family gathering, and every holiday reminded them of the price they were paying. The secret didn't disappear with time. It quietly shaped every relationship that followed, until Moses and Naomi unknowingly found each other and forced the past back into the light. Tears filled Bishop Carter's eyes as he looked first at Moses, then at Naomi. "I spent years believing I was protecting this family," he said, "but I wasn't protecting anyone. I was protecting my own fear. Every lie I told created another lie, and every secret I kept became a burden for all of you to carry." Bishop Carter told Moses all the wealth he had comes from Gloria Brooks, Naomi's mother. Gloria Brooks stepped beside him, unable to hide her own regret. She admitted that she had wanted to tell Naomi the truth many times but lost the courage whenever the opportunity came. Both parents realized that their silence had stolen something precious from their children, the chance to build their future on trust instead of uncertainty. The heartbreaking reality became clear to everyone in the church. Moses and Naomi were never the problem. Their love had never threatened the family. The real enemy was the secret both families had protected for more than 3 decades, believing that silence could heal wounds that only truth could mend. Moses looked around the sanctuary at the faces of the people he loved most. He realized that anger alone would not undo the past, nor would blame erase decades of pain. The truth had finally been spoken, and although it had come at the worst possible moment, it had also broken the chains that had held both families captive for years. Turning toward Naomi, he gently took her hand once again. They both understood that forgiveness would not happen overnight and that rebuilding trust would take time. But they also understood something even more important. Love had survived every obstacle placed in its path, while the lies had only brought heartbreak. As they stood together before their families, one lesson became impossible to ignore. Secrets may protect people for a season, but the truth is the only foundation strong enough to carry a family into the future. Moses Carter and Naomi Brooks stood quietly before the altar, surrounded by the same people who had gathered to celebrate their marriage only hours earlier. The flowers were still in place, the choir remained seated, and the wedding decorations had not changed. Yet everything felt different. The truth had finally been spoken, and although it had brought pain to every person inside the church, it had also lifted a burden that had been carried for more than 30 years. Moses looked at Naomi, realizing that the woman standing before him was never the reason for the heartbreak. Naomi looked back at Moses and understood that the man she loved had never deceived her. They had both become victims of decisions made long before they were born. For years, they had been living inside a story written by fear instead of honesty. Now, for the first time, they had the opportunity to write their own ending. The question was no longer whether they loved each other. The real question was whether their love was strong enough to survive a truth that had shaken 2 families to their very foundation. After several moments of silence, Moses gently took Naomi's hand once again. He looked toward both families before speaking with a calmness that surprised everyone in the room. "We can't change what happened 30 years ago," he said. "We can't erase the choices that were made before we were born, but we can decide what happens from this moment forward." Tears filled Naomi's eyes as she nodded in agreement. She knew the road ahead would not be easy. Trust would have to be rebuilt, relationships would need time to heal, and forgiveness would not happen overnight. But she also knew that walking away would only allow another generation to live under the weight of fear and silence. Their future would no longer be controlled by secrets they never created. Instead, it would be built on truth, compassion, and the courage to face the past together. One by one, family members embraced each other, not because every wound had healed, but because the healing had finally begun. As the church slowly emptied, the elderly woman who had interrupted the ceremony quietly smiled through her tears. She had not come to destroy a wedding. She had come to stop another generation from living a lie. Her painful decision to speak out had given Moses and Naomi something far more valuable than a perfect wedding day. It had given them the truth. And sometimes, the truth arrives in the most painful way before it becomes the greatest gift. As they walked out of the church side by side, Moses and Naomi understood that love is never tested by perfect moments. It is tested by the storms it survives. Their journey proved that families are not broken by love itself. They are broken when fear replaces honesty, when silence replaces trust, and when lies are allowed to grow across generations. Love doesn't destroy families, lies do. If you were Moses Carter or Naomi Brooks, would you fight for love or walk away? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe and turn on your notifications so you never miss another unforgettable story from Mojora. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.